Welcome back to this episode of Reclining at Table with Jesus. We're considering Hebrews 12 verse 11 and some of the things the Bible has to say on the idea of suffering. We've seen from verse 11 that it's not pleasant, it's always painful. We've seen also that it can produce bad fruit and there can be problems with suffering. It can make our hearts hard to God. But today and in the next 5 episodes, I would like us to consider how, by God's grace, this bitter tree can produce good fruit. And we can see some of the positive things, dare I say, that suffering can do when God is in it and we are trained by it. So the first thing I want to say about the fruit that God can produce in our suffering is that it's normally in the darkest times and the most difficult times does the Lord Jesus come near to us and reveal himself to us. I don't think ever have I heard a Christian say it's in the easy times of my life that I've tasted the sweetness of the presence of Jesus. They normally tell me it's in the darkness and in the storms that they've come to know Jesus Christ in a real deep way, where he has revealed himself to them. And you'll see this right throughout the Bible. So in the next 5 episodes, I pray what I say will help you and even heal you, and we can view suffering in more of a productive way. But notice in chapter 11 when it talks about Moses, and in verse 27 it says, "By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king," that's Pharaoh, "for he endured as seeing him," that's God, "who is invisible." So it was at this point where Pharaoh was angry with him that God revealed himself to him, and he saw him who was invisible. And you will see throughout the Bible, this is how God tends to work. He reveals himself to his people in the darkest and most difficult of time. Let's think of Jacob in chapter 28 of Genesis. He's just robbed his brother's birthright. He's been blessed by the dad. He's running from his home because his brother wants to kill him. And it says in verse 11 that he falls asleep on a hard stone. And it's at that point that he sees a stairway to heaven. And then in verse 16 and 17, he tells us that this is the stairway to heaven and this is the house of God. And he didn't recognize it. And he says in verse 17, this is an awesome place. It's the house of God. But it was as he was running and fleeing from a dangerous situation did God reveal himself to him. And it was the same in chapter 32. Now Jacob isn't running from his father, he's running from his father-in-law, Laban. And he's running right directly into the face of his brother Esau. So in front of him he's got his brother Esau who's angry with him. Behind him he's got Laban, his father-in-law, who's angry with him. And he's stuck in this tight place and he's got nowhere to turn, and he's crushed by angry people. And it's at that point he wrestles with God. And it says in verse 30 that truly God is in this place, for I have seen him face to face. So the times that Jacob have been at the most difficult of his life is the times that God turns up to him, whether when he wrestles with him in chapter 32 or whether it's the stairway to heaven in chapter 28. You will see the same thing with Job. We know what happened to Job and his family. He lost his family, he lost his livelihood, he had boils and sores himself, and he lost everything. And in 42 chapters, there's this great verse in verse 5 of chapter 42, and it says, Job says, "I have heard of the Lord, but now my eyes have seen." It's something in the midst of the terrible suffering he's been through where the hearing of God has changed to seeing. We think of Mary Magdalene who came to the tomb in John chapter 21 on the resurrection of Jesus. Chapter 20 of the resurrection of Jesus. And she was weeping because they didn't know where they'd taken the body of Jesus. And she turns and sees the gardener. And it's at that point she realizes the gardener is Jesus because he says Mary. But it was at the tomb when she's weeping, Jesus turns up and she recognizes Jesus. Think lastly of John the Apostle, the disciple that Jesus loved. He would recline by table with Jesus, But it wasn't till he went through suffering in Revelations 1 verse 9, where he's been exiled to the island of Patmos, where it says that on the Lord's day, in verse 10, he was in the Spirit and he saw the Lord. It's when John went through suffering and been exiled and persecuted did he see the Lord, and he wrote the book of Revelation. And if he didn't go through the suffering, we wouldn't have the book of Revelation. So I want to encourage you that often in our difficult times, and when we feel like we are downcast and our souls are in turmoil, whether because there's trouble within or without, fear within and fighting without, the Lord often meets his people and reveals himself in ways that we've not really experienced before. Not our ears anymore hearing, but our eyes would see. So please come to Jesus. If you're in a storm, please come to him, because he's your anchor. If you're in the midst of illness, come to Jesus, because he is a great doctor. So please come and see and rest with Jesus and trust him and beg him and ask him to come to you and reveal himself to you in your dark times. May God bless you today.